All right, thanks Hans, and good morning everyone. So this presentation is going to build on earlier talks that I've given about my watercolor maps of ecological edges and islands. The meaning behind these maps has been evolving a bit over the past year or so, and so today I'm going to focus on that with two specific examples of watercolor maps and the islands that inspired them. So I'm entranced by ecological islands and the edges that define them because of their clear sense of structure and definition, essentially their smallness. These environments give me what I think of as an empowering world at my fingertips sensation, kind of a sense of the natural world being compressed and sliced into smaller pieces that are more comprehensible and less overwhelming. And I say ecological islands because while islands can of course be defined by water, they can also be determined by other conditions such as contrast and precipitation, like in this image here. And actually the examples I'm going to focus on today contain both types of these islands that are nested within each other. So I have the urge to further compress and accentuate my experience of these geographies that already seem to me to be like miniature worlds in real life. And I do this through these map-like watercolor compositions that combine multiple ground level and aerial views together, kind of taking a cubist approach. More recently, as islands and edges have become increasingly degraded and obliterated by climate change, habitat destruction, invasive species, and other threats, this kind of idiosyncratic world at my fingertips motivation has evolved to emphasize more specifically the expression of rarity, endangeredness, and preciousness, you might say. But this idea of preciousness in an ecological sense is complicated and kind of loaded. And I'm going to talk about how I see these two watercolor maps as starting to engage this additional complexity. So the first work was inspired by Robinson Crusoe Island, which I visited in 2019. It's about 700 kilometers off the central coast of Chile. It's about 30 kilometers long, and it's where the actual sailor who partly inspired William Defoe's fictional Robinson Crusoe was marooned, hence the name of the island. It has really dramatic topography and this main ridgeline here that you can see in white, and as a result it has pretty extreme contrasts in precipitation. There's a very lush windward side. This rainforest is really high in endemic species, actually higher rates of endemism than the Galapagos. And then the island grows progressively drier as you move toward the western tip of the island because it's in the rain shadow of that ridgeline. So this is the map that came out of my experience on Robinson Crusoe. It's oriented vertically, roughly 90 degrees to the actual geography, and in a moment I'll talk about why that is. The title of the work comes from the name of the viewing point that's located on that ridgeline called Mirador Selkirk, named after that sailor. And it's a point from which you can see both those wet and dry landscapes simultaneously. So my aim was to capture and accentuate this sense of compression and insularity, both of these mini islands of wet and dry and of the actual overall island of Robinson Crusoe that they're situated on. So again, these two island types kind of nested together. And that sense of compression is again overlaid with this quality of specialness and preciousness. Part of that is kind of an exotic allure that many islands have for us, this sense of there being a world apart, often because of dramatic topography and also biological uniqueness. So the watercolor captures a day-long hike that I took from east to west across the island from wet to dry. You can see the desert-like western tip of the island here. There are also some barren-looking patches along the east coast, which, given the wind direction, really shouldn't be there. I'll get to why they're there in a moment. And here's that same path abstracted, overlaid on the watercolor. I've turned the whole thing horizontally to make it a little bigger and also to orient it a little bit more to the actual geography, but you can see how distorted that path is from the real-life path. The reason the work is meant to be oriented vertically is that I feel like the sense of traveling toward a destination is better expressed moving from bottom to top than it is from side to side. So again, the original intent was to emphasize this idea of preciousness and fragility of these island environments as a result of its smallness combined with the environmental threats that it faces. But importantly, this threat component of it is not explicitly shown in the watercolor. There's only one settlement on the island, as you can see here, and it has less than 1,000 people. Despite that, though, the degree of devastation to the indigenous landscapes of the island is pretty extensive. You can see a particularly dramatic example of deforestation here, and the erosion that's resulted from that. I should say that's actually why you see these barren areas along the East Coast. These were all forested at one point. Where there is forest canopy, the understory is often desiccated like this as a result of foraging by rabbits and other invasive species. Other areas, the forest is heavily taken over by exotics. All these bright green trees here are non-native trees. The native trees are actually these little pockets higher up. And the skinny part of the island where you have that transition from wet to dry is heavily overgrazed, and so as a result, it's been mostly taken over by native weeds. Sorry, exotic weeds, not native. So in the watercolor, I obscured all of this degradation purposefully. This is the eastern slope of the island above the town, which is almost entirely covered by non-native forest and scrubland. And I actually traveled this part of the route by vehicle in the dark early in the morning because I didn't really want to see it. And also I represented only by this one view in the watercolor shown from a distance. And so because of that distance and also the ambiguity of the watercolor medium, you really don't get any sense of what these tree species actually are, what kind of forest that actually is. This is a view from that mirador on the ridgeline, looking toward the dry western tip of the island. There is native forest that spills over the ridgeline, but again, it's heavily invaded by exotics. You can see the bright green trees here. Also, this scrub in the foreground is all exotic species as well. So what I did was actually, quote unquote, transplant what I thought were much more evocative native species from another part of the island that's a lot less accessible, and transplanted those species, tree ferns in this case, to kind of replace those exotic shrubs on the ridgeline. I did the same thing with the island's one endemic palm species, which is very, very rare nowadays, and it's almost gone from the main hiking route. So I also transplanted some individuals of this palm from other parts of the island into the watercolor. So again, the goal was to impose this sense of stability and pristineness on an island where it really doesn't exist anymore. And this fractured compositional style is meant to impose kind of a sense of boundaries to accentuate this quality of ecological insularity and separation from outside forces. But despite that idealization, I see this environmental reality of disturbance as being still revealed in a way that I didn't intend it to be, paradoxically through that same fractured style. Because, the way I see it, this fracturing simultaneously suggests a sense of instability, of environmental flux, and of shattering, so to speak. And that's particularly since the fragments in this work have a particularly angular form and are kind of shard-like. I think also the vertical orientation contributes to this sense of instability and sort of imminent collapse. So essentially, this sense of fragility and precariousness is made up of two components that are in tension with each other, both expressed by the fracturing style. On one hand, the sense of ecological boundedness and isolation and structuredness, versus on the other hand, a sense that that very isolation is increasingly unstable and illusory. So this next example is based on a place that's actually remarkably similar to Robinson Crusoe Island geographically. It has about half the area and the population, but same order of magnitude. It's also about 700 kilometers from the nearest landmass, in this case, the southeast coast of Australia. It's almost at exactly the same subtropical latitude. It has a linear form and similarly dramatic topography, which rises to almost exactly the same maximum elevation as Robinson Crusoe. And it's evolved its own unique species and ecosystems. It also happens to be named after a person, in this case, the First Lord of the British Admiralty. One difference, though, is that the climate here is more subtropical humid than Robinson Crusoe, which is more Mediterranean overall. You could consider it borderline tropical. It's kind of analogous to Bermuda because of the warm ocean current. And as a result, it also has the world's southernmost coral reef. Another difference is that despite the dramatic topo, there is not the sharp wet and dry contrast that Robinson Crusoe has. But it is still very ecologically diverse. The narrow part of the island is covered by kind of a semi-moist forest, but it grows drier. It takes on this drier and scrubbier form as you move toward the rockier tip of the island. You can see it in these two views here. On the mountainous, the wider eastern part of the island, which is much more mountainous, the tops of the two peaks are covered by this unique fairy tale-like mist forest, which, as the name suggests, is dependent on moisture from cloud cover. This is me visiting the summit of the island in 2009. And in the watercolor, which you can see in the map gallery, by the way, toward the back of the room, like in Mirador, the goal was to accentuate this sense of unique contrasting environments which are squeezed onto this really tiny island, in this case only about 10 kilometers by 1 to 2 kilometers. And again, on top of that, this overall sense of preciousness related to kind of the exotic, alluring, cinematic quality of the landscape. The mist forest, I think, in particular has this sense of feeling special and isolated, kind of like a separate world unto itself because of its inaccessibility. Actually, and reaching the summit of the island in this forest was probably the hardest day hike of my life. It's about an 8-hour hike. So here you can see the routes that are depicted in the watercolor map. Unlike Robinson Crusoe, where it's that one single hiking trail, this is a combination of various routes along different roads and trails. And here are the paths overlaid on the watercolor map. I've again turned the whole thing horizontally to make it a little bit bigger. Actually, though, this map I originally intended to be horizontal, which, as you can sort of tell here, is kind of the more natural, expected way that you would see it. But since I literally finished this work about 2 weeks ago, after I'd been thinking for some time about this tension between stability and instability, I rotated it purposely vertically in order to again capture this sense of instability and precariousness. Unlike Robinson Crusoe, unlike Mirador, which again the rotation was more, or the sense of precariousness was more incidental to that rotation. Unlike Robinson Crusoe, Lord Howe's environment is native vegetation is relatively intact still. There are some clear areas for settlement and for grazing, but they're small and I think kind of picturesque. Invasives are a problem, as you'd expect on any isolated island. There have been a number of animal extinctions and near extinctions, but in terms of the overall experience of the landscape, they're pretty inconspicuous. Those invasives are pretty inconspicuous. You really don't get a sense of them when you're exploring, especially if you're an outsider like I was. There are no forests of exotic species. There are some areas of non-native trees, like these clumps of conifers, but they're pretty self-contained generally. So in the watercolor, there was really not need for much obfuscation or idealization like there was in the other one, to create this sense of alluring specialness. The island really is as amazing as I tried to show it in the map. But it does face threats from invasives and also from climate change especially. So you do have this sense of underlying precariousness just below the surface, especially with the mist forest because it's so reliant on predictable moisture. And while there isn't, I don't think, the sense of shattering that you have in Mirador, the fractured compositional style does still create this idea of ecological movement and flux. And the verticality, again, creates a sense of instability and of imminent collapse. And I think actually more in this case than in the other watercolor map, because so many of these views ended up being turned sideways and because the composition is kind of top-heavy. Again, because the rotation was not originally intended, and so it ends up producing some of these kind of unexpected, maybe even a little bit awkward results. Also, the title of this work, Perched, most literally and obviously relates to the bird, but it also, I think, relates to the idea of the mist forest clinging kind of precariously to the steep topography. And when you're in it, you also have this sense of being suspended above the rest of the island, often inducing actual vertigo in many places. And more metaphorically, I think it also creates this sense of the island struggling to maintain its ecological balance and stability. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of preciousness and fragility in an ecological sense is loaded. It implies that ecosystems have some inherent sense of stability and isolation in space and time to begin with, something to be disrupted in the first place. But as is being increasingly recognized, this image of historical permanence and pristineness is largely an illusion. And in fact, you could say, I think that in these watercolor maps, the element of instability suggested by the fracturing might simply represent just this inherent condition of ecological flux that's been quote unquote natural to the natural world since life evolved, both human caused and not. So maybe this fractured style is actually less about disintegration and agitation and disruption or shattering than it is about this more so-called natural ongoing dynamism. It is debatable, I think, the degree to which we should treat today's rapid ecological change as just an inevitable acceleration of this more historical dynamism. Personally, I think it's kind of a sliding scale. This image of environmental stability is culturally valuable to us in many cases, and I think it's worth preserving when we have the resources to do so. But it's important to recognize that this is not what nature wants, so to speak. It's what humans want. Nature can't really want anything, right? So I see these watercolor maps as unintentionally revealing a sort of tension between what I call isolation and integration. Isolation in the sense of these island environments as being truly insular, superficially pristine, and thus with a sense of fragility, as opposed to, on the other hand, integration, which implies an inseparability from the wider world and from humanity. So moving forward, this tension is something that I might try and engage more deliberately in these works, now that it's kind of surfaced on its own, as I started to do in Perched with the title and with the rotation, and especially since I think a lot of us are struggling to deal with these contradictions, not just me. But I expect that this will mean navigating a clear path through these contradictions rather than actually resolving them either in the maps or in my mind. So, thank you.